My son didn't raise his voice when he said it. That was the part that stayed with me. We were standing in his living room, the late afternoon light cutting across the rug I'd helped him choose years ago, and he said it like a reasonable request, like he was asking me to pass the salt. You need to apologize to her, Mom. Or maybe it's best if you leave. No anger, no hesitation. Just a clean sentence, already decided. I remember thinking how strange it was that the house still smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls while something so final was being placed in front of me. People think ultimatums come with shouting, but the most dangerous ones don't. They come wrapped in calm, because calm means the speaker believes they're right. I looked past him then, toward the dining table where the plates were already set. I'd arrived early, like I always did, carrying a casserole dish that was still warm from my oven, and a small bouquet of herbs from my garden, tied with twine because that's how my late husband used to like things simple, useful, alive. Her mother was seated at the table, back straight, hands folded, eyes scanning the room as if she were inspecting a hotel she hadn't yet decided to stay in. She'd commented on the smell of my dish earlier, said it was strong, said it in that careful voice people use when they want to sound polite while making sure everyone hears the insult. I didn't respond. I rarely do. Silence has always been my way of keeping the peace. And for most of my life, it worked well enough. The trouble started small, the way it always does. A comment about how people from my generation didn't really understand presentation. A laugh about how her family did things properly. My son didn't laugh, but he didn't stop it either. He busied himself with opening a bottle of wine, turning his back at just the right moments. I noticed all of it, of course. Mothers always do. We notice what our children don't defend. And when her mother reached into her purse and said her brooch was missing gold, small sapphire, sentimental, irreplaceable, the room tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the day my husband died, and the doctor avoided my eyes. She didn't accuse me outright. She didn't have to. She looked at me slowly, deliberately, and then looked at my son. That was enough. He didn't ask me if I'd seen it. He didn't suggest we look together. He stood up, squared his shoulders, and delivered the sentence he must have practiced in his head. Apologize to her, or leave. I remember smoothing my napkin, straightening the ring on my finger, the same ring I'd worn through 35 years of marriage, through hospital nights and school meetings and weekends worked, so he could have better shoes than his classmates. I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder, something clearer. I said 3 words, quietly, without drama. You'll regret this. Then I picked up my coat and walked out of the house I'd helped pay for, down the path I'd helped pave, without looking back. I didn't cry when I got home. That surprises people when I tell them later, because they expect tears, expect collapse. But grief had already taught me what crying was for. And this wasn't that. This was something else. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, the same one where my son had done his homework, where we'd eaten pancakes on Sundays after his father passed, where life had continued because it had to. I took out a folder from the drawer not because I planned to do anything drastic, but because writing things down has always helped me think. I wrote down every comment, every look, every moment my son chose comfort over fairness. I wrote calmly, carefully. This wasn't revenge. This was record keeping. I raised my son alone after his father died. People like to romanticize that sort of thing, but the truth is, it's mostly quiet exhaustion. You work weekends. You learn how to fix what breaks because there's no one else to call. You smile at school events even when your back aches and your bank account doesn't. I never reminded him of those things. I never kept score. When he got engaged, I was happy for him in a way that felt like relief, like love had found somewhere else to go, somewhere younger, stronger. I gave them money for the house. Not a loan, a gift. I told myself that was what parents did when they could. I told myself it would be remembered. It wasn't. Not really. After the wedding, invitations came less often. Holidays shifted. First one missed Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then his birthday celebrated somewhere else, with people I'd only ever been described to. When I asked, gently, I was told it wasn't personal, that things were just easier this way. I stayed quiet. I brought food when invited. I complimented the decor. I swallowed the small humiliations because that's what mothers are expected to do. Once their children grow up, fade gracefully, be grateful for scraps of inclusion. That dinner, though, changed something. It wasn't carelessness. It was intent. And intent is harder to ignore. What I didn't tell anyone at first was that the night I left his house, I also remembered something important. I remembered that when he asked me, years ago, if my name should stay on the house paperwork just in case, I'd said yes. It felt like a formality then, a precaution no one would ever need. We never revisited it. No one rushed to remove me. I trusted that love made such details irrelevant. Sitting at my table, pen moving steadily across paper, I realized that trust and protection are not the same thing. And if there's one thing women my age understand, it's that protection has to be built deliberately, especially when silence stops being enough. By the time I finished my tea, I hadn't decided what I would do. I only knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't apologize for something I hadn't done. I wouldn't beg to stay where I was no longer wanted. And I wouldn't pretend that being a mother meant surrendering every last boundary. The house was quiet around me, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm or after a decision. I went to bed that night knowing my son believed he'd drawn a line. What he didn't know, what almost no one ever realizes until it's too late, was that lines work both ways, and some of them take time to show their weight. The days after that dinner moved slowly, but not softly. People assume distance dulls things. That time smooths the sharp edges. But what it really does is give you room to notice patterns you ignored. When you were busy making excuses, I noticed how quiet my phone was. No apology, no follow-up, just a short message 2 days later from my son that said, "We should talk when things cool down." As if respect were something that overheated, as if dignity spoiled if left out too long. I didn't reply. That alone would upset some people. Mothers are supposed to respond, to reassure, to chase peace, but I wanted to see what silence did when I stopped using it as a shield and let it sit there, unanswered, like a question no one wanted to face. I went about my routines. I watered my garden in the mornings, clipped herbs, wiped down counters that were already clean. Ordinary motions become grounding when your inner world shifts. And as I worked, I kept thinking about how easily I'd been dismissed, how quickly my years of quiet support had been reduced to an inconvenience at a dinner table. That's the part that sticks with people my age, the realization that loyalty is often expected upward, never downward. Children are encouraged to build their own families, but parents are rarely allowed the same evolution. We're meant to remain available, grateful, undemanding, useful, but invisible. A week later, I received an envelope from the bank. Thin, official, the kind you almost throw away before opening. It referenced the property on Elmwood Drive, the house my son lived in. Our house. According to the paperwork. I sat down before I finished reading it. A habit formed from years of bracing myself for bad news delivered politely. It was a notice about a lien. $42,000. Secured against the property. I read it twice, then a third time. Slow enough that every word landed. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't agreed to anything. But my name was there, listed neatly, legally, as co-owner. Which meant I was entitled to know. Which meant someone had acted as if my consent were optional. I called the bank the same day. I didn't raise my voice. I asked simple questions. Who authorized it? When was it processed? Could I see the documents? There was a pause on the line. The kind that tells you you've crossed from customer service into something more careful. When the PDFs arrived in my inbox, I opened them at my kitchen table. The same one where I'd written down my son's ultimatum days earlier. The signature was mine in shape, but wrong in feeling, too rushed, too careless. My middle name spelled incorrectly. It was a forgery. Clean enough to pass if no one looked closely. Sloppy enough to fall apart if they did. That was the moment something hardened inside me. Not into anger, but into resolve. I thought about the brooch. About how quickly the accusation had come. How neatly it had been staged. About how her eyes had flicked to my purse, my coat, my hands. People who have never been quietly accused don't understand how violating it feels. How the shame lingers even when you know you're innocent. And suddenly, the pattern was clear. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was strategy. I wasn't being edged out by accident. I was being erased with intent. I didn't call my son. I didn't confront his wife or her mother. I made copies. I labeled folders. I pulled old emails where my son thanked me for the down payment, for the help, for being there when things felt overwhelming. I printed bank transfers, wedding expenses paid in my name, utility bills I'd covered during their first winter. None of it had been given with strings. But strings appear when people forget where things came from. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. One meeting. No drama. No threats. Just facts. The lawyer listened quietly, nodding now and then, the way professionals do when they already know where something is headed. He told me I had options. Civil action, reclamation, protection. Words that sound harsh until you realize they exist for moments exactly like this. When politeness fails and silence is mistaken for consent. I told him I didn't want to punish anyone. I just wanted what was mine, and I wanted the line made clear. He said that was reasonable. That word reasonable meant more to me than any apology would have. My son came by the following Friday. He brought dinner from a place I liked, as if familiarity could smooth over what he hadn't acknowledged. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, eyes shadowed. He talked about work, about stress, about how complicated things were at home. He never mentioned the dinner, never mentioned the accusation. And that, too, was a choice. When he finally paused, waiting for me to fill the space, I told him calmly that I'd spoken to a lawyer, that I'd be asserting my rights regarding the house. The confusion on his face shifted quickly into fear, then into something like disbelief. "You can't do that," he said. "That's our home." I repeated the word "our" back to him, softly. Silence stretched between us again, but this time it wasn't protective. It was revelatory. He left without eating. The food sat untouched on the counter long after the door closed. I didn't chase him. I didn't explain myself further. There are moments when explaining only weakens the truth. The paperwork went out the following Tuesday. certified, precise, unemotional. By Friday, his wife was gone. No confrontation, no goodbye, just absence. Accounts emptied, closets cleared, a note left behind that said enough about who she was when things stopped going her way. And in the quiet that followed, my son returned, not demanding, not defensive, but shaken, stripped of certainty. Some people watching this would say I went too far, that I should have swallowed the insult, kept the peace, let my son choose his marriage without consequence. Others would say I waited too long, that I should have protected myself years earlier. That's the divide I see now whenever I think back, the way people judge mothers differently, depending on whether we endure or act. We're praised for sacrifice, but punished for boundaries. And as my son sat across from me that night, eyes downcast, I realized this wasn't just about property or paperwork. It was about whether a woman who has given most of her life to others is allowed, finally, to say enough and mean it. By the time my son came back again, the house felt different, not emptier, but steadier, like furniture that had finally stopped being pushed around. He didn't knock the way he used to, confident and casual. This time it was hesitant, almost formal, as if he were approaching a place that no longer automatically belonged to him. I watched him through the window before opening the door, noticing how he stood there rehearsing words he didn't yet have the courage to say. That pause told me everything. People only hesitate when they know the balance of power has shifted, and that realization settles into the body before it ever reaches the mouth. He stepped inside and looked around as if he were seeing my home for the first time. The same pictures on the walls, the same quiet order, but something in his posture suggested he finally understood that this space wasn't a backdrop to his life, it was a life of its own. He sat down slowly, hands clasped together, and began explaining things I hadn't asked to hear. How he hadn't known about the loan details, how his wife had handled the paperwork, how her mother had insisted they needed quick cash, that it was only temporary, that I would never notice. That last part landed heavily, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I had already suspected. My silence had been mistaken for blindness, my trust for absence, my age for irrelevance. As he spoke, I thought about how often mothers are expected to absorb the consequences of decisions we never made. We raise children to be capable, independent adults, and then we're told to step aside quietly when those adults misuse what we built together. Society praises sons for choosing their wives, but rarely asks whether they've learned to choose integrity alongside loyalty. I let him talk until his explanations circled back on themselves, until the words lost momentum and fell apart under their own weight. Only then did I tell him what I had done next, something I hadn't shared with anyone yet. I had contacted the lender directly, not to threaten, not to plead, to clarify. I explained that my signature had been forged, that I was prepared to pursue the matter formally if necessary, and that I wanted the lien removed from my name immediately. The response was swift and clinical. Internal review, verification, compliance procedures triggered. These are the moments people don't talk about, the quiet machinery that moves when you stop accepting what's been done to you. Within days, the lender froze the account. Within a week, the responsibility shifted squarely where it belonged. And with that shift came consequences no one had planned for. My son's face drained of color when he realized what that meant. Credit damaged, assets scrutinized, questions asked that couldn't be smoothed over with charm or urgency. He asked me why I hadn't warned him. I told him I had, just not with words. I reminded him of the dinner, of the accusation, of the way he had watched and said nothing while my character was quietly dismantled. Warnings don't always come as speeches. Sometimes they arrive as moments where you're given a chance to stand up and choose. He had chosen comfort. Others had chosen control. And I had chosen myself. That's when he said it, the thing that would echo for weeks afterward. I didn't think you'd actually do anything. Not I didn't think. It was wrong. Not I should have protected you. Just that. And in that sentence lived every assumption that had led us here. That a mother's role is to feel, not to act, to forgive, not to enforce, to endure quietly and be grateful for whatever scraps of respect remain. I told him that assumption was the most painful betrayal of all. Worse than the forgery, worse than the accusation, because it revealed how small he had come to see me. Word traveled fast after that. Family friends called, cautiously at first, then more directly. Some praised my strength. Others warned me I was risking my relationship with my son. A few asked outright how I could be so cold. Those conversations fascinated me. No one asked why my boundaries had been crossed. No one questioned the morality of using an elderly parent's assets without consent. The discomfort always landed on my reaction, never on the action that caused it. That's how deeply ingrained the expectation of maternal sacrifice is. We're supposed to suffer gracefully, and anything else is seen as cruelty. My son stopped staying over. He began calling late at night instead, his voice frayed, uncertain. He asked what he should do. He asked how to fix things. He asked whether I could help him straighten it out. That last request hung in the air like a test. I told him I loved him, but I wouldn't rescue him from consequences that were designed to teach him something he had refused to learn gently. Love doesn't mean removing every hard edge from someone's life. Sometimes it means letting them feel the weight of their choices without cushioning the fall. Weeks passed. His marriage officially ended, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with paperwork and silence, the same tools that had once been used against me. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He showed up one afternoon, unannounced, thinner still, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and for the first time since all of this began, he cried openly in front of me. Not loud, not theatrical, just the quiet, breaking kind that comes when illusions finally collapse. He told me he didn't know who to trust anymore. I told him that was the beginning of wisdom, not the end of it. And that's where the real controversy lies, I think. Some people will say I broke my son to teach him a lesson. Others will say he broke himself, and I simply refused to glue the pieces back together for him. Mothers watching this will split down the middle, half applauding, half horrified. Because this story forces an uncomfortable question no one likes to ask out loud. At what point does protecting your child turn into betraying yourself? And is a mother allowed, even once, to choose dignity over harmony without being labeled the villain? The begging didn't come all at once. It arrived in stages, which somehow made it harder to watch. First, it was hesitation, my son standing in my doorway longer than necessary, as if waiting for an invitation that used to be automatic. Then it was uncertainty, questions phrased like statements, statements phrased like apologies. And finally, it became what he had once accused me of never needing: humility. He sat across from me one evening, hands folded the way they had been when he was a boy being scolded, and asked me what I wanted from him now. Not what would make things easier, not what would fix his situation. What I wanted. That question, asked sincerely, would have been enough months earlier to stop everything from unraveling. Now, it landed differently, too late to undo, just in time to reckon. I told him the truth. And the truth was quieter than he expected. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want obedience. I didn't even want repayment in the way people usually mean it. I wanted acknowledgement, not the casual kind that dissolves under pressure, but the kind that costs something. I wanted him to say, out loud, without excuses or qualifiers, that he had failed to protect me when it mattered, that he had chosen peace with others over honesty with his own mother, that he had assumed my love meant my limits were imaginary. Saying those things felt like pulling splinters from old wounds, necessary, painful, and long overdue. He cried again, but this time, it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Some viewers will be uncomfortable here. They'll say a mother shouldn't demand confessions from her child. That love should be unconditional, limitless, forgiving without prerequisites. But unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional access. That's a lesson people my age learn late, often after paying a steep price. I loved my son before this, and I loved him after, but the shape of that love changed. It stopped being self-erasing. It stopped bending around his comfort. It stood upright for once, and that stance unsettled everyone who had benefited from me staying small. Word got around, as it always does. Extended family weighed in. Old friends took sides. Some praised my strength. Others whispered that I had hardened with age, that I had become difficult. I listened to all of it with a strange calm, because by then I understood something I hadn't before. Controversy isn't created when someone does something wrong. It's created when the wronged person refuses to pretend everything is fine. That refusal exposes the quiet bargains people rely on, especially the bargain that mothers will absorb pain to keep the family image intact. My son asked if things could ever go back to the way they were. I told him no, not because I wanted to punish him, but because going back would require me to unlearn what I finally understood about myself. We could move forward, I said, but only if forward included respect that didn't disappear when it became inconvenient. Only if my age stopped being treated like a weakness. Only if he remembered that I am his mother, not his safety net, not his silent partner, not the woman who cleans up messes she didn't make in the weeks that followed. Our relationship rebuilt itself slowly and unevenly. Some days felt hopeful, others felt distant. There were awkward pauses where old habits used to fill the space, and yet something real had replaced something fragile. He no longer assumed. He asked. He listened. He disagreed without dismissing. And when he spoke about his future, he no longer spoke as if I were already behind him, irrelevant to what came next. That shift didn't come from lectures or forgiveness alone. It came from consequence, from the moment he realized that my silence had ended, and with it, his entitlement. This is where opinions will split hardest. Some will say I taught my son a lesson he'll never forget. Others will say I damaged a bond that should have been protected at all costs. Both can be true, depending on what you believe a mother is for. Is she meant to be a buffer against reality, or a guide through it? Is her role to preserve peace, or to model self-respect even when it disrupts the room? I didn't choose this story because it was clean or comfortable. I chose it because it was honest. And if there's one thing I want people watching, especially those my age, to sit with, it's this: the moment you realize your worth does not decrease with your usefulness is the moment everything changes. You may lose approval. You may stir resentment. You may even be accused of cruelty. But you will gain something far rarer: the ability to look at yourself without regret. My son learned that lesson late. I learned it later. And if that makes some people uncomfortable enough to argue in the comments, then maybe it's because the truth touched a nerve they've been avoiding. Because the hardest thing for a family to accept isn't betrayal. It's a mother who finally stops accepting it.